Thanks for that opening prayer there. I'm calling this dematurity because what I'm really trying to take a look at is what causes people to behave in a less mature way when they're older than they did when they're younger. And I know some people are going to hear that and think, well, it's not possible. And it's definitely the exception, not the rule, okay? Because we understand that most people, as they get older, do learn from life and they become more mature as they get older. But almost everybody has probably met someone who's old and doesn't act their age, if you know what I'm saying. And sometimes we kind of write the people off as we might think there's something medically wrong with them. Like, okay, maybe they don't exactly have Alzheimer's, but maybe they got something else that comes with old age. Sometimes we call these people senile. But in reality, there are some things that will cause people to be less wise as they get older. There are events sometimes people go through. And what I wanted to take a look at was, what are the things that happen in someone's life and how do they react to those events that causes them to actually behave in a less mature manner? I would say that probably the thing that probably tops this list would be, I'm going to put three things kind of together, is anger, bitterness, and unforgiveness. Okay, and these are things that tend to feed off each other. Because when you get angry, a lot of times because you're angry at someone, what happens? You don't want to forgive them. Okay? But then that unforgiveness causes anger and bitterness. So the two basically feed off each other and cause each other to happen. And when you allow yourself to get caught in that cycle of anger and unforgiveness, which leads to more anger, which continues to make the unforgiveness even more stubborn, which leads to more anger, then a lot of times other things sprout out of that cause people to behave in a less mature manner emotionally. One is that when people get caught in this cycle, they become less patient with people. This is in one way you'll see this real common is you'll see people in their 20s or 30s that have got more road rage than they did when they were 16 and first got the driver's license. They've lost patience with the other guy on the road. And sometimes you just simply have to sit back and realize that a lot of times anger comes out of that desire to control things. You know, and sometimes people just simply have to remember there's no point in getting angry about what you can't control. But some people still allow themselves to do it. Okay? And if you don't learn that lesson real early, then it can lead to some, I guess, a worse emotional state later on. Another thing that this often leads to is that people become less understanding of others, less empathetic. Okay, because when you've been harmed by other people, a lot of times, in order to remain in that unforgiveness state, I mean, if I understand where you're coming from, it becomes easy for me to forgive you, right? So what happens? You know, the enemy starts to move in, and he realizes that in order to keep that foothold, in order to keep that person's state of unforgiveness, you've got to shut down their empathy. And so they become, as a result of losing patience with people, they'll have less of a desire to really understand where that other person's coming from. You know, less of a desire to understand them as a human being, less sympathy for what they're going through. And those are elements you need to have in order to deal with people on a mature level. Because in order to effectively deal with the people around you and to deal with them on a mature level, the most important thing to doing that is understanding them, understanding where they're coming from, understanding what makes them tick, and having a sense of sympathy for what they're going through. And when you lose that, and when that goes out of your life, then you're not dealing with people as effectively as you should. So that's another reason why this emotional state leads to dematurity, a less mature way of dealing with the people around you. People also, because of their loss of patience, often become more demanding. You know, it becomes more about what I'm going to get out of the people around me than what I'm going to contribute to the people around me. Okay, so they become more demanding, which also leads to a lower state of maturity. And quite often when people have been hurt by the people around them, they begin to put up defensive walls. And they put up those walls, they put up emotional walls in order to keep from getting hurt again. But those same walls that people put up in order to prevent themselves from being hurt also prevents you from getting close to people. It prevents you from experiencing joy. It prevents you from, enjoying life as it's supposed to be around you. And so it kind of prevents that free flow of love that's supposed to be in a relationship. With your friends, you might have various levels of trust that's supposed to be in a relationship. I mean, between acquaintances, you may not necessarily have to have a whole lot of trust. But with close friends, you've got a little bit more trust that needs to go on, right? In order for two people to get close as friends. If you're, relatives, there's an even stronger level of trust. And if you're living in the same house with members of your own family, there's a lot of trust that has to go on. Okay? But when people begin to put up defensive walls, what happens? That level of trust goes away. I don't trust you, and you become an untrustworthy person because of your defensiveness. Okay? And that has to be there in order for you to mature and grow as a person. Because, you're going to get hurt in life, but you just got to go out and expose yourself again. You can't allow that hurt to cause you to shut off the way God intended for relationships to flow. Our Messiah said, if you're struck on one cheek, turn the other, right? I mean, you've got to expose yourself again. You've got to allow yourself to get hurt in order for you to interact with the people around you the way God meant for you to interact with the people way around you. And sometimes it's going to get bad, but you just got to shrug that off. I would venture to say that in probably, I'm going to just guesstimate this, but probably a very high percentage of cases in which you find someone who's old and behaving in a far less mature way than his age, that in a very high percentage of cases, you've got anger and unforgiveness going on. Now, there's some other things I'm going to talk about here, but one of the reasons I brought this up first is because out of all the cases in which I've seen this, I've seen anger and unforgiveness present in an awful lot of people who are at an advanced age, but not behaving very maturely. Another chain of events I've seen that causes this is selfishness. And this isn't, I guess you could call this selfishness that sort of evolves in the reverse, because a lot of times we kind of understand that babies are, when you're born and brought in this world, you're at kind of an ultimate state of being selfish. It's all about me, I mean, for a baby, I'm the whole show, okay? But eventually you grow out of that as you get older. Now, but there are some people who are extremely selfish and they've got themselves fooled. And the reason they've got themselves fooled is because in their younger age, they may have been a model of altruism. They may have been the first person that would sacrifice in order to make the situation around them better. Okay? And, they may have actually been in the habit of doing that for years and years and years, and then one day something snaps inside of them. And they begin starting to keep score. Say, hey, wait a minute, I'm always the one that's doing for other people. I'm always the one that's sacrificing. What about me? Why isn't anybody sacrificing for me? A lot of times at that moment in their life, they never give in to another person again. They will spend the rest of their life in completely selfish and demanding mode. And they kind of feel like, the world owes it to them to give in to them. Because they've spent half their life. I mean, this can happen to people at the age of 40 or 20 or 50 or whatever. But they kind of feel like they've spent the first half of their life being the person that was always sacrificing. And they therefore, because they're keeping score, they therefore feel like, I have the right to be a demanding person for the rest of my life. And that's what they turn into. And they don't think of themselves as selfish because they've spent years and years and years not being that way. But they've actually, I don't know what you call this, is that anti-repenting or, Is it just penting or what? Okay. But when you actually change your mind in the wrong direction and go from behaving the right way to behaving the wrong way, okay, this is another thing that could cause dematurity, because these type of people, they get very angry about all the sacrifices they made, and they therefore become very demanding upon the people around them, and they just refuse to give in. And we've got to understand that the mature thing in life is really that there's give and take. I mean, you're supposed to, make sacrifices for the people around you, and, you're supposed to do that without keeping score. And if you do keep score, then it can lead to that moment where someone snaps and completely changes. But there has to be give and take with the way you interact with the people around you. Okay, it can't be all about you. And when it does, again, this is another thing that causes dematurity. Now, those are examples of, I guess, emotional dematurity. But there's also mental cases of dematurity. And this is something that can go on in the mind. I think the emotional issues are probably bigger, and they take a deeper root and probably have more effect than the mental ones, but the mental ones are still there. Among some of the mental ones, I think with the mental ones, sometimes it's like an area of your thinking that's going to demature, even though the other areas of your thinking might not be as badly as affected as what really happens when you've got emotional dematurity going on. Now, to give you some examples of that, I think that probably one case of where mental dematurity goes on is when people reject reality. And I could give you several examples of what I mean by that, by rejecting reality. But God has designed a world in which we are supposed to get more mature as we interact with people. The more we interact with people, the more mature we're going to get, right? Some people might mature faster in 20 years than other people will in 30 if they've gone through more interactions or more events in their life, because they've learned how to handle more things than someone who's, hasn't had much happen in his life for a long time. In order for us to actually learn from life, we have to accept reality for what it is. Now, when we reject reality, we can actually get dumber. Let me give you a few examples of what I mean by that. When I talk politics with people, one of the things I like to say is that there's a free market in every society. In communist countries, they call it the black market. But there's still a free market in every society. Okay? Because if the government decides, it's really terrible that bread costs as much as it does, let's pass a law so that you can't charge any more than 15 cents for a loaf of bread, because everybody should be entitled to cheap bread. Well, what's going to happen? I mean, the farmer who's growing it and turning it into bread is going to say, well, it's not worth my time to take what I'm growing in the fields and grind it up and bake it and turn it into bread if I'm only going to get 15 cents out of it. Okay? So what's he going to do? He's going to sell it on what the government's calling the black market for a price that's worth his time. And that's one of the reasons why the Soviet Union fell apart. They couldn't keep anything in their stores because they were trying to keep prices cheap. They therefore couldn't supply the demand that existed, and the whole system fell apart. It's happening right now in Venezuela. They can't keep food in the stores. Why? Because they've they've bought into the false idea that they can control the market. But what's happened here? What you've got is you've got this false premise. That false premise is, I can control the market. Part of the reason that trying to control the market doesn't work is because they have accepted as their foundation a false premise, or a lie, if you will, that the market can be controlled. And when you try to build on top of a foundation that's made of falsehood, what happens? You're going to get more falsehood. If you draw conclusions based on that false premise, you're going to draw false conclusions. Okay? And that's basically what happened in the Soviet Union, part of the reason it fell apart. God has designed a world where we get more mature as long as we accept reality for what it is. If you reject reality and you start thinking black is white, up is down, true is false, then you're building a foundation that's false, and then you're trying to build on top of that. And so building on a lie gives you a bigger lie, not, not truth. Okay? And it basically leads to disastrous results. Maybe another good example of that most of us have seen happen in real life has been the use of, I guess, intimidation. And when you're a kid, you probably see this a lot with the little boy who's the bully on the playground who says, give me your lunch money or I'm going to beat you up. Okay? Or, over in the girls' side of the corner, it's usually, do what I want or I'm going to spread a rumor about you. Okay?
I think I had somebody do me like good.
And of course, that happens a lot in elementary school. Now, as we get older, that happens a lot less because people begin to realize, a lot of the people who are doing it begin to realize, sometimes that works, but it works with some of the people some of the time, but it doesn't really work with all of the people all the time. And sometimes I do it and I get in trouble, and then I end up looking bad, and then I'm the bad guy. And so eventually, a lot of people stop. Some people just simply morph. Okay, when I say morph, I mean they start using more adult tactics, like if they want to try to get something out of their neighbor, they might say, well, either you do what I want you to do, or I'm going to tell the homeowners association that your flower bed is 5 inches too short. And boy, is that going to cost you a lot of money to fix. Or you get the guy in business who's trying to get something out of one of their business partners. And he says, hey, either you give us this clause in the contract or we're going to sue, and, the attorney's fees are going to cost you more money than if you just cave into us. And those are like more adult level tactics, but it's still the same thing going on as the bully in the playground. Okay?
Adult manipulation.
Yeah, right. People sometimes do this with adult level things instead of kid level things, but they're still using intimidation as a tactic. They're still working off the false premise that negative input creates positive output. Yeah.
One quick thing. I've seen how Sharia law is becoming part of America, like it or not. And part of the technique that's used to make Sharia law or Islamic law possible, so to speak, is intimidation. Because they say, if you don't be politically correct and let us and accept us and do this and that, then we'll sue you or we'll do this and that to you.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and the whole political correctness thing, it is a bully tactic, really, because it's like, well, either you agree with us or, you're going to be shamed, you're going to be, insulted. And nobody's ever insulted their way to the top.
They tried.
Yeah, but there are people that are trying, and that is a tactic that's in use right now. So, that's a very good point. And God has designed a world where positive input is what we're supposed to use in order to create positive output. When you fail to realize that simple fact, and you continue to operate on the premise that negative input creates positive output, then that's another thing that can actually lead to dematurity, because you're not learning how to deal with people in the way God intended to. He didn't mean for you to control people by saying you do what I want or bad things are going to happen to you. He's trying to create a world where I do something good for you in exchange for you doing something good for me. That's the way He's designed things. And if you don't learn that lesson, if you're not looking for that as being your solution to how to get what you want out of other people, which is the exchange of good things with each other, then at best you're not going to grow in maturity, and at worst you're going to demature. Because if you buy into the wrong thing as being the right answer, that wrong idea could lead you to opposite conclusions that the right idea would lead you to. It all depends on how far away from that you get. Another category that causes dematurity, or again, at least a stunting of someone's growth, is ignoring the consequences of your actions. Okay? Now, God's designed a world where if you do bad things, usually bad things come back to haunt you as a result of the bad things you did. Okay? But if you ignore those consequences, then a lot of times you're not going to learn the lessons that God had for you to learn in life. One example of this, and this is what I talked about, I guess it was a few weeks ago, a few months ago, when I talked about Lashon Hara, and I talked about how a lot of times people who wag the evil tongue and talk bad about others often don't realize how much damage they're doing to themselves. Right? Nobody really wants to tell them, hey, you shouldn't say that, because they don't want to be that person's next target. So a lot of times when people start wagging the evil tongue, they never realize how much damage they're doing to themselves. They're doing a lot of damage to another person, and maybe they think that something good's going to come out of doing damage to that person. But they don't understand the negative consequences that are actually happening to them. And
the scientists, the astronomers.
Yeah. And sometimes when they do, a lot of times it's too late because they've already maybe ruined the biggest chunk of their life by engaging in that kind of behavior. Or another example, I had somebody I was talking to this past week who suggested to me, he said that, another thing I could think of is sometimes when someone burns the candle at both ends when they're young and then they burn out when they get older. You can maybe think of a number of examples of like that when we don't know where our limits are or where they should be. A lot of times we don't realize kind of the negative consequences we're bringing on our life. Another case, though, is a lot of times people see the negative consequences that happen in their life, but instead of accepting it, instead of saying, oh, I did this and this bad thing happened, they get defensive, and what they do is they start blaming other people for the bad thing that just happened. Okay? Oh, no, this bad thing happened, but no, it's not my fault. No. You did this, right? If you hadn't done blah, 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 this wouldn't have happened. Okay? And when you begin playing the blame game, then the best thing that's going to happen to you is you're not going to learn from life, because you're not going to realize that the bad things you did were a mistake, and you're going to go out and you're going to make that mistake again.
We reap what we sow.
Yeah. And you're going to keep getting bad consequences as a result of it. And that's the best thing that's going to happen. The worst thing that's going to happen is you're actually going to demature. Because if you continue to make the same mistake again, and continue to blame somebody else when bad results happen, and you actually buy into the idea that what you did to cause these bad results is actually a good thing, then you've essentially rejected reality, and you're going to be pursuing the wrong answer for the rest of your life. Another thing that can cause dematurity is maturing in the wrong things. God's kind of created a world where we're supposed to put our relationships over what we get out of them, right? I mean, like, if you've got a person who's a car dealer, sells used cars, I mean, because he's your friend, who knows, he might sell you the best car he's got on his lot, right? But you shouldn't want to take advantage of people in either direction in that situation. I mean, you shouldn't assume that because he's your friend that, he's going to sell it to you for half of what it's worth. Or that because he's your friend, if you're the car salesman, you shouldn't assume that because he's your friend, hey, he'll trust me so I can really snow him over. Either way, I mean, either one of those attitudes is bad, okay? And sometimes that's kind of the way people begin to view things when they start being more concerned with what they get out of a relationship than the relationship itself, okay? If you talk to people on the streets, probably one of the things I've heard a lot from, gang members or drug dealers or people that I guess you would call people who live on the streets, even though they probably live in a house, but we use that phrase, right? one of the things I've heard a number of times from people that are living that kind of a lifestyle is either you're a player or you get played. Anybody heard that expression before? Yeah, you've heard it too? Okay. Translating that, what they really mean by that is either you're a user or you get used. That's what they really mean when they say that. You know, either you use people for what you want to get out of people, or they're going to use you. Now, that really shows you that they've got a bad outlook on life. I mean, that really tells you that they're at the extreme of not seeing people for friendships at all. And they're looking at people as nothing but, sources of a connection who can maybe do me a favor in different areas. And that's a very bad perspective. And some people get real good at using people. Some people really learn a lot about how to manipulate the people around them in order to get what they want out of them. But the more you learn those lessons, the more you're going to unlearn the lessons God really wants you to learn. Because that's not what He wants you to be wise in. What He wants you to be wise in is those personal relationships themselves that those kind of people are ignoring. Because God's plan is not to use people to get things. His plan is for us to use things in order to help people. Okay? And He wants us to try to bless others so that in the future, that'll come back as a blessing to us. Now, this is kind of a list of some things that can actually cause dematurity, but generally, and I may not have caught them all here. Maybe you guys could think of some other things, but certainly rejecting reality, rejecting consequences, and I guess that the example I just gave is when you've got your priorities reversed, it's very easy to learn the wrong lessons instead of the right lessons. But ordinarily, people do get more mature as they get older. And in Leviticus 19:32, there's a verse that says to rise in the presence of old age and to honor the face of the elder. And that's kind of something, that's what we should be doing. But you actually don't see it too much. When was the last time you saw somebody stand up when someone in their 80s walked in the room? Anybody seen that happen? We don't do that in our society. Now, there may be some societies where that kind of happens. I think in Japan they probably bow to their elders. So there are societies where that goes on, but we seem to live in a society where we've actually got this thing reversed, and we make fun of people who are older. Okay, I've heard jokes before. I can remember someone say, "Hey, who gave you that tie? Was it Abraham Lincoln?" Ha 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 ha. If you were around in Abraham Lincoln's day, that wouldn't be something to be ashamed of. That'd be something to be proud of. Okay, because if you've lived that long, that should be a big blessing, not something to be ashamed of. But we live in a society where we've kind of turned this thing around and made old age sound like it's a bad thing, when in reality we should be looking at it as a good thing and something that's honorable. There's actually a context that commandment's in that I kind of want to talk about. I want to go back to Leviticus 19:29 and kind of read through a few verses here. If anybody wants to open their Bible to 19:29. And I want to read verses 29 and 30. Keep in mind, this is setting the stage for the commandment I just talked about honoring old age.
Do not profane your daughter by making her a harlot, so that the land may not fall to harlotry, and the land become full of lewdness. You shall keep my Sabbaths and revere my sanctuary. I am the Lord. Okay, now, do you all see a connection between these two verses? Or does this sound like it's two totally different things? Well, there was religious prostitution going on. As far as the Sabbath is a religious thing in the sanctuary. Of course, that wasn't Yahweh's way. Well,
I think there is a connection here. for most people, if you read 29, which says not to profane your daughter, that's, for most people, not a temptation, because most people are going to read this, particularly in our society today. Most people are going to read this and say, yuck, who would do this? Okay, because your own daughter's purity is probably pretty important to you, right? But I think the reason, one thing that is common here in both of these verses is that you're talking about a young woman's purity being defiled. Okay, in verse 30, you're talking about the Sabbath, the holiness, the purity of the Sabbath being defiled, or the purity or holiness of the sanctuary being defiled. So these two verses do have something in common here, because in both cases, you're talking about the purity of something being corrupted. Okay? And why does God put these together? Well, probably most people would look at their own daughter and, you know, the ideal of corrupting her purity is something that you're going to say, yuck, that's disgusting. But are you going to have the same reaction about the Sabbath? Would you have the same reaction about the temple? Would you have the same reaction about anything else God has declared holy? And I think the reason God put these together is because what He's essentially saying is that He wants you to view profaning the things that He considers holy as disgusting as profaning the things that you consider holy. So He's drawing an analogy here. And He wants you to catch that analogy. Okay? Now, let's go on to verse 31. Anybody want to read verse 31?
Do not turn to mediums or spiritists. Do not seek them out to be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God.
Okay, now, here we've still got the concept of defilement going on, right? So for 3 verses, that's been a common theme to all 3 commandments. And we've also got, we've got, this is morphing a little bit, because one thing I want you to notice here is that each of these commandments have something in common with what came before, but they've got something different. So it is morphing a little bit. But the important thing is to try to catch what's in common here. Now, when He says don't turn to ghosts or spirits or whatever, there's a verse in Isaiah that I think kind of helps rephrase this in a very logical way. It says, why consult the dead on behalf of the living? There's 2 things going on here. First of all, when you do this, it says you're defiling yourself. And I guess the reason for that's obvious, because you should be seeking God's counsel, right? I mean, you should be seeking God's wisdom. So when you start turning to these dark spirits and seeking advice from them, the way you should be seeking advice from God, then you're defiling yourself. Okay? But there's also an illogical element to this, because you wouldn't go talk to a German about how to fix the problems in Russia. Okay? You wouldn't go talk to somebody in Saudi Arabia about how to fix the problems in China. Okay? I mean, if you don't understand that culture, you're not really going to be able to understand how to fix every problem that they have. Now, I mean, there's maybe some things you might have some insight on, but certainly when it comes to cultural issues, you're not going to... Somebody from inside that culture is going to have to rise up with the right answer to fix the problem. Okay? And why would you talk to somebody in another whole dimension about a problem that humans have? I mean, you can't expect for them to give you advice that's going to be in your best interest. They're not human. You know, they may not care about you. They may not relate to you. It's really illogical thing to do. So you're actually seeking out advice from a stranger who's not part of your culture, which is just simply an unwise thing to do, right? Then he starts talking about rise up before the aged, honor the face of the elder. Why is he saying that? Because the elder, they are, this is, again, connected with the previous verse. These are the kind of people whose advice you should be seeking. Okay? You don't go seeking advice from someone who's not even human. Okay? God said don't do that. He just got done saying don't do that. But who should you be seeking advice from? People that have lived a long time. People that have gone through what you've gone through. I mean, now maybe if they've lived a long time and, hadn't gone through what you've gone through, they may not be able to relate to what you're going through. Okay? But your elders, the people that have gone through life and faced a lot of things, are going to have some good advice for you. And that's one of the reasons that God says to honor Him. And I believe it's one of the reasons it's right next to this verse on who to seek out for advice about. And one of the things that I think helps prove that is that if you move on to verse 33, it says, "And if a stranger sojourns with you in your land, do him no wrong." Well, there's definitely a connection between that and verse 31, because what is a spirit? Well, that spirit is a stranger. I mean, he's a stranger to your culture, right? So you're still on the subject of strangers. And the old man is not, you could ask yourself, well, is he a stranger? Well, he's not you. And I guess he's not living your life. So in some sense, he's, in maybe a minor sense he is, but in a major sense, more your culture than not. Okay? Because if he's part of your culture, but older than you, then he's gone through a lot of the things that you're going to go through and has some good advice to give you. So when we actually take a look at the context that this commandment's in, I think it actually helps show us a number of other things about it. So anyway, that's basically what I've got for today. Anybody have any questions or comments they want to add to this? Or?
I kind of like that.
When you started out with the emotional aspect of it, about anger, unforgiveness, over the accumulated effect of those things, and then bitterness and settle in, and happens all too often. That was a pertinent analysis. It's something that we all have to be on guard against. The accumulated hurts and issues, if they're not forgiven on a timely basis, it doesn't turn into embittered soul in the latter years.
And I have run into a number of older people who are like this, and I would say in a number of cases I've actually seen when you're dealing with older people who don't seem to behave maturely or seem to do some silly things, that quite often anger and bitterness and unforgiveness is part of their story if you get to know them long enough. In a very high percentage of cases, that's true. Not always, but it does seem to be. Yeah, but it does seem to be the most common problem out of all of these. Yeah, or sometimes unforgiveness can be, it can take on either a real strong form or a mild form, because sometimes, like if someone's done you wrong, you might have trouble forgiving them. Maybe you eventually get over it because, unforgiveness is something that can really eat at people. And like maybe after a while, they'll finally get over it, let it go, and let what they have against that person go. But if they get hurt by another person, and then another person, and then another person, particularly if it's somebody who's in the same row, like let's suppose somebody who's been, a guy who's had 5 wives, and he's mad at all 5 of them, or or if he's someone who's had, like, say 3 friends in their life, 3 best friends that double-crossed them and betrayed them in some way. A lot of times maybe they've let go of the bitterness and the unforgiveness that they had towards each of those individuals, but they might not have completely gotten over letting someone in their life in that capacity again. And there may still be a sense of unforgiveness against people in general.
Yeah, Joe, I thought that was really good. my first degree was in social sciences. I took a lot of psychology courses. And as you were starting to get into this, it came to my mind that this is really true in a sense, I'm not mixing the terms, godly psychology, if you will.
Yeah.
What God would have us to do through the Spirit of God in our hearts, and how to react to the hurts and the situations we all encounter in life. But in school, the psychology professors, I don't recall them really talking about these things, not in the way that Joe just talked about them. But this is really this is the real deal here. Now, decades later, I wish that young people today that take social sciences or get a degree in that with psychology, major or minor or whatever in sociology, would consider these things that you brought up, because that's the truth. That's the truth, is what you presented today. So I really appreciated that.
Oh, well, thank you.
Hopefully I'll take it to heart as time. God gives me more years of not become one of those individuals that you were bringing out something can become. Those three things that we harbor: the unforgiveness, the anger, and bitterness.
Yeah, and a lot of times, life, people when they're young, you start out with kind of a clean slate, and you've got a pretty optimistic view of life and what you want to accomplish, and then along the way, it usually doesn't happen as well as you had hoped it would happen. And everybody has a few disappointments in life, but you can't let those disappointments run the rest of your life. You just got to brush them off and go on and not worry about them, and kind of keep that optimism about what you're going to do with the rest of your life, no matter how old you get. Well, let's pray over this lesson here. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for what we've learned, and ask you to help us continue to mature in life and not fall into the traps that are going to cause us to reverse our thinking or to move away from the lessons that you have us to learn. But make sure that we continue to learn from our mistakes and not repeat them, and accept responsibility for what we've done, and to be able to embrace your ways with a more mature attitude throughout our lives, and not end up like any of the examples we've discussed. Shem Yeshua, in our Messiah's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Click below to subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to visit my website at www.messiahalive.net. That's www.messiahalive.net.